In the first half of this interview with Kieran Knutson, president of CWA Local 7250 in Minneapolis, we talked mainly about the union's relationship with the employers on the job, including the question of organizing the unorganized. Here in the second half, we talk about the wider political activity of the unions, their relationship with the Democratic Party, and what are the alternatives to that. Cheryl Zuur, former president of AFSCME Local 444, also has some valuable insights on these issues. We started with a discussion on the failure of the union leadership to mobilize their members around the wider social or political issues that workers face in this country. This discussion went on during the time of the Derek Chauvin trial, and so that issue obviously entered into the discussion.
No, I think we have to have a different model. We have to look to try and see these struggles as working class struggles that are important for unions to be a part of. And also, also have a kind of multiracial component, which so much of our society doesn't have that. Everything is still very segregated, I think, in the community. And so to have any kind of body that would be multiracial, I think could be an important example as well.
It's been a while, but there was a moment in the protest last year where there was a call on the part of a few unions to remove the police fraternities from the AFL-CIO. Right. Well, it died. We all know that it died, but it still stands as a fact that they are not unions as we know unions to be.
Right.
And that discussion has completely gone away, but the historical fact and present fact remains that police have never been the friends of workers. They are never on the side of worker struggles, and that they will come in and bash in the heads of workers and shoot at them as necessary during strikes or actions and all that. So if I were president of a union right now, depending on the situation in the union, but I think that I would call for a meeting on that. I would and talk about the history of the police in the working class. It's combined with racism and just the way that you talked about it, that it's an attack on it. So, and how that works, because we know that we live in a racist society, but I think that's a really critical conversation that has to be had, because that's not going away. And we know that the strategy of the prosecution and of Keith Ellison? Yeah, in Minnesota is to have Chauvin convicted on most serious charges, maybe even. That could happen. It could become second-degree murder, we hope. And then he's the bad apple. And then we go on about our business and nothing is changed.
Right.
So, and that's a very likely outcome. So I'm just saying that if I were president of a union right now, I would want to be having that conversation with my members to prepare for the future and to talk and for people to learn about, especially in Minneapolis. I mean, with the incredible history of the Teamsters there, and all that can be learned from that. So, and also the question of, well, I don't know how you could talk about this, but the question of, the Teamsters formed what were they called? Like the flying squads. I mean, they had their own sort of, they did a lot of incredibly powerful organizing things that I think we can learn from today, the flying squads. And the question of how do we protect Black workers? How do we protect our brothers and sisters in the union and outside of the union from the police? How do we protect them and ourselves? It's a really critical question for our times.
Agree with all that. 100%. Yep. No, I think we need to figure out some ways to have, like we've had a number of discussions about this in the last year, but we need to kind of come back to it in a big way, and also I think prepare for the verdict, however that plays out. But I think your point is right too, that it's important not just to organize around Chauvin getting convicted, but there is the system strategy clearly, which is sort of a first, because they never even like to get rid of one cop, is to paint him as a bad apple, that he wasn't following the proper training, all this kind of stuff. And you're right that we have to talk about what is the actual role of the police in the society, and what should our attitude be towards the institution of the police, not just treat it as bad apples.
If it if it weren't for COVID, would it be possible to do something like get a motion passed in your local to authorize this, assuming that it would pass, that the local call a labor community public meeting that's sponsored by the local, at which, and you as president would be chairing the meeting, and you and the local would invite this and this and this victims of police abuse, or the families of somebody that was killed by the Minneapolis police, and then, you know, really make a push to get some of your own members involved, to have like a public forum like that, and with the purpose of, okay, how can the community and labor join together to deal with this critical issue? If it weren't for COVID, would something like that be a possibility?
Yeah, I think so. I think something like along those lines. I mean, I'm not sure. You know, there's a lot of different organizing that's happening in the city right now, and figuring out how to connect to that, and how to strengthen the best parts of it. You have to figure out. COVID is definitely a factor in trying to have like public meetings, for instance. But yeah, I think there's a need to have those discussions and make that a priority within the labor movement. And I think we need to figure out how to do that, and our local needs to figure out how to do that.
There's a bill in Florida specifically that is going to really make the penalties for if you end up participating in a protest that goes awry, burns a flag or does something, you could spend decades, it could ruin your life. They profiled one young Black man in a place called Plant City, Florida. They were protesting, and a truck arrived near the end of their demonstration with Confederate flags, and there was an altercation, and someone grabbed the Confederate flag and burned it. And they arrested this young Black man, and he is facing prison time, and he is speaking out against this this I don't know what to call it, anti-riot legislation that is taking, going in many different states. This is something that the workers' movement really needs to pay attention to as well. It's added to the pile.
Yeah, I think there was some, the St. Paul police tried to get something passed in St. Paul, which is, the twin city to Minneapolis. Yeah, they tried to slip in something that would have prevented, like, anybody that showed up to a protest with like helmets or this or that would be, extra criminalized and stuff. And it got exposed and withdrawn. But I think that you're right, there's going to be all these different attempts to, under the guise of extremism, I think, to attack, the rights of people to organize militantly.
Kieran, you've commented, and both Cheryl and I have commented, elsewhere, on labor's relationship with the Democratic Party. And it kind of, in some ways, hovers over the entire labor movement like the shadow of a chicken hawk over the chickens. It has like the sometimes hidden but massive effect. What alternatives you see to that?
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. I think it's basically the way that the official labor movement tries to shape our politics, and more than that, it's the way that the ruling class, the rich and powerful in our society, are able to sort of shape their opposition. So I think that the Democratic Party plays a role of being able to sort of shape and control the labor movement, not in the interest of the workers. And it's a big problem. I think because of that, a lot of working class people feel like that's our only, getting a strong Democratic Party majority is the only way we can ever make anything happen. And so our horizons are really limited as to what's possible. So, yeah, I think that we absolutely have to understand that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, although often, most often the Republican Party is worse. I don't have any problem saying that. But both parties are not parties for, poor people, for working class people, for the unions, for the, oppressed communities in this country. Both of them represent, the rich and powerful. And and neither one is, neither one is a friend to us. In fact, they're both, I think, our enemies. And then your bigger question, which I think you want to get into the debate of, which I'm happy to, is about the alternative. And for me, I think it's about building, federations of militant opposition to this system as a whole, that we need to have, unions, community organizations, tenant groups, self-organized groups of across the working class, and a patchwork of all our different interests and constituencies and needs. And then we need, federations of these groups that have each other's back and have solidarity and have also some vision, some common vision of what we're trying to fight for, and to try and draw it sharply how it's distinct and different and opposed to the current setup, the current system, the current way we live. And my disagreement, I think, with you, John, is that I don't think that the electoral avenue or the so-called party building approach is enough of a break from what we need. And that even when people are using it to, what I see anyways, is that when people are building third party stuff, that even when they see it as being a break with the Democratic Party, that they end up still incorporating people into the electoral system, which teaches people a lot of times the same methods of approach, that you kind of organize around one charismatic candidate. You sort of, you use the election system that the system uses to decide things. And, you orient around that election day as your big push. And so to me, it ends up functionally having some of the same problems, actually, that people that want to operate within the left wing of the Democratic Party have. And well, I'm not saying that to, cast aspersions on you, as, but that's how I see it playing out. And so instead I see like models like, the CNT in Spain in the 30s, that was not just a trade union, but also an association of youth groups and women groups and neighborhood assemblies. And I think they, at least to some degree, were able to contrast themselves with the system in a sharp way that resonated with people, and they were able to build on that basis. They made lots of mistakes too. But
well, let's back up a second from the question of elections themselves.
Yeah.
And I agree in some senses with your criticism of how a lot of people pose this idea of a working class party. But first of all, you talk about federations. I mean, to me, that's really talking about an organization.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so what would be, and you're talking about an organization on both the local, the regional, and also the national level, with democratic controls in it, with democratic structures and so on, that's based in the working class, that brings workers together to fight on their own behalf,
mm-hmm.
and to pose all issues, whether it's a question of racism, the environment, whatever, to pose all issues from the class point of view. So, yeah, I mean,
you're asking me how is that different than a party?
Exactly. That's
okay.
That's where I'm headed. I mean, because we tend to think of political parties, because in the United States there's never been a working class party. We tend to think of, and this includes 99% of those who advocate for a working class party. We tend to think of political parties as just purely being an organization that functions around election times and getting pieces of legislation passed. Whereas a working class party would be something different. In my view, it would be its fundamentals. It would be born through what you and I and Cheryl, I think, what we all see as a necessity.
So I don't want to get too caught up in like the word party, but I think that what it almost always is used to describe is a political formation, usually in a hierarchy, in a social hierarchy, with a few leaders on top and going down, it sort of casts itself as an alternative state, that this is the alternative leadership to society that we will replace the old leadership of society with. I think that's almost always how a party presents itself. And I think that's true of even what I would assume some of your revolutionary party models might be. I still see them as having that kind of approach. So I think it's not so important. I think it is extremely important that the working class be organized, but be organized beyond just being a member of one centralized political organization, whether it's a federation or a party, but that there be just a multitude of working class organization, so that not only will mean that issues that might get swept under the table or put way down, far down on the list in some organizations, have people that are advocating and, fighting for them. I think we've all, been in the left for many years. We all understand that some issues that are important today haven't always been important, and that often were put way down on the list. But the reason why they've become prominent issues in society is because there was groups of people that were willing to organize and advocate around and that stuff. And I mean, I think like, gay and lesbian and trans movement would be one example. The situation of disabled people would be another example, and on and on and on. And so I think it's more important than having one sort of centralized organization under democratic centralism would be to have, a patchwork, or not a patchwork, but a tightly woven net of social organization across the class that is able to coordinate, that is able to make the strategic decisions together and have those kinds of debates and act together, but is also autonomous and has some ability to retain its own ability to discuss and fight around particular issues of importance to themselves.
I mean, everything that you've described about the problems with political parties is true. I mean, I've been doing a lot of reading about the Weimar Republic era in Germany, and before that. And of course, we know historically, if you've read about that, the problems of the SPD and the unions and all of that. Talk about bureaucracy and World War I and on and on and on. And yet, but workers, especially in this country where we've never had, our own political party, are that's what they relate to. We can't change that in this moment. That they understand there's an instinct, there's just an instinct there that, okay, well, what's the next step? Because all battles ultimately lead to politics. I mean, at some point, maybe in our lifetimes, if we're lucky, there will be political strikes in this country. Maybe your union, maybe even will lead them. I mean, right now, the strikes that unions, carry out are on economic issues. We haven't seen any political strikes against a war or, things like that. But that time could come, and then it really will matter. So for me, we obviously, given everything that you said about the problems and the pitfalls of building parties, where are you going to go? It's like so we know that at some point down the road, we don't know when it will be, the Biden administration will drop the ball, and there will be huge disappointments in that agenda, and the compromises will be made. And where will workers go? We already know a whole bunch of them went to Trump. And that's something that really concerns me, that if there's not another magnet of attraction to pull them in, that more of them are going to go in that direction. We know damn well that 2024 could see the election of a more competent Trump type figure. So these are the things that are on my mind about an alternative to Democrats. So, and based in the class.
I think we agree on the need for some organization that exists not just only in the workplace, but in the working class as a whole, that can coordinate workers' struggles and help workers learn from their experiences and move forward. And that has a national presence, but also where workers in Minneapolis or Tallahassee or wherever have, and not just, but workers and working class youth and so on, they can take initiative as they see fit.
Mhm.
So then but then both for today, I mean, workers are going to say, when we say no, don't support the Democrats, they are going to say, well, what's the alternative?
Mhm.
And they're going to say, I mean, we can say, well, you can say, well, we don't believe in elections,
Mhm.
but I don't think that's going to fly right now.
Mhm.
I mean,
No.
and you can say, well, we don't support the capitalist state. But to me, what that's saying is, until you become a revolutionary, there's no alternative for you. And so, and I get what you're saying about running people for office has certain dangers. I agree with that. There's a lot of intermediate steps before that question even necessarily is posed. But if you're committed not to running people for elections, I don't see how it can be avoided to fall into the trap of supporting the best or the least bad of the capitalist politicians.
Yeah.
And yes, you have to point out all the dangers and how this is not going to solve our problems. But this is the alternative that we face unless all workers are ready, or the majority is ready to just end capitalism altogether.
Well, I mean, I know we're not going to agree on this, but just some more points to think about, I think, is that there's actually a tremendous amount of the class, particularly the most oppressed parts of the class, that don't participate in the elections and that haven't for decades. And there's been some movement on that, but only a little blip, really. And I think to a large degree, any success of the kind of group party you're talking about would have to convince those workers that they should be voting in the system, and that my point is that you're probably not going to get votes. Your votes are probably not going to be enough coming from the people that are already voting. So that what you'd have to do, in fact, would be to try and convince people that aren't voting right now to vote. That would have to be a big part of your strategy and your energy and your focus. And I just wonder if does that make sense? Is that what our approach should be towards working class people who decided that you don't have an orientation towards the electoral system? And I guess I feel like I totally agree that we need an alternative and that we need to be able to say that this it's not good enough to support the lesser evil. But I think that is, we're trying to, we try and build a movement that stands sharply outside of it. And that isn't to say that everybody will agree on everything, or that you have to be 100%, committed to picking up the gun today or something like that. I just think it means that we conceive of movements and we try and argue for other people to conceive of a movement that is against and outside the electoral state. And to me, I feel like that it has risks as well, but I don't see how it sort of automatically, I've never been convinced that it sort of automatically translates into support for one of the other candidates or something, or into support for part of the system. I mean, to me, it sort of explicitly is against it. So I don't get that argument, actually, but my argument would be stronger when there's an example.
So this is a conversation that has been going on for years now.
That's
and
right.
It's part of the necessary discussion and also disagreement amongst serious working class fighters, and it's going to continue.
I was going to say it's just really refreshing and delightful to have this conversation with you, Kieran, because in so many settings it's just not even possible to talk in these kinds of ways about these things. Another thing I was going to add is that, so here in the Bay Area, I don't know how familiar you are with the sort of leftist swamp. Just call it that. Yeah. It's a leftist swamp. And mostly what it creates is, so you have all kinds of activist organizations, police monitoring this and anti-war that, and it's just, so these organizations, someone rises to the top, or maybe it was the founder, maybe it's a nonprofit, and inevitably those people either become an activist in the Democratic Party, or that's the direction that all these organizations ultimately feed into, for the most part. And again, this is where the problem for me becomes that, again, there's nobody, this is just sort of how, this is what's considered normal. And I don't know what it would look like if what you're talking about, federations, et cetera, how that would be different. It seems like, for me, I mean, the ideal scenario would be a combination of the two, so once again, I mean, this is just, it's a very concrete problem in reality on the ground that, wherever you have, protests and uprisings or organizations, it's going to go in a political direction. And I mean, if we just pretend for a minute that we didn't have political parties, which is ridiculous, okay, where would they go? But we do have political parties. And so, and that's where everybody ends up. And that's one of the biggest problems I have with it. You have really decent activists that are genuine, and they get sucked into the damn swamp of the Democratic Party, of the fringes of it. There's no place else for them to go. And so that's a concrete problem.
I mean, I think, to try and organize in a way that cuts against the powers that be, that's tries to be fearless and not looking to just fit into whatever way the system allows people to organize, but to push up against it and aim to have a different vision of what kind of society is possible. And I think it's really important to not just be in kind of little activist bubbles or little small bubbles within your local, but to really try and connect with as many working class people as possible, both as a way of checking your ideas and for increasing the power of our potential.
Well, thanks, Kieran, for your time, and this discussion will be continued.
Get up, stand up.